So we have talked about all kinds of info objects in the system, okay, or all the Lego pieces that are possible in the system. So the next question is, how do we organize those pieces so that they are easily identified and easily accessed? And that's the role of info object catalogs. Okay, so info objects are organized into info object catalogs, and generally speaking, we should create separate catalogs for key figures and characteristics. Okay, so you have a key figure catalog for key figures, and then you have a characteristic catalog for characteristics. And also notice that each info object may be assigned to several catalogs. Okay, so even though a info object catalog can contain the same type of info objects. Okay, so one catalog can have many info objects. At the same time, one info object can be assigned to several catalogs. Okay, so I guess it all depends on the requirement. So we can do this many-to-many assignment, but in general, we still want to make sure that only the same type of info objects are grouped together. Okay, key figures are organized into the same catalog, and then characteristics are organized into another catalog, and so on. And then info object catalogs themselves are organized into info areas. Okay, so when in fact info area is used to organize not only info object catalogs but also info providers, which we'll talk more about in other chapters. Okay, but briefly, info provider is an object that provides information or data to reports, for instance, or queries or reports that we will produce from the data warehouse. Okay, so you have also all kinds of info providers possible, and therefore to organize them, we'll create info areas. Okay, but also notice that each info object catalog and info provider can be assigned to exactly one info area. Okay, so now if you're looking at info area to catalogs and info providers, that's one-to-many relationship. One info area has many catalogs or many info providers. But each catalog can be assigned to exactly one info area. Okay, so each catalog cannot belong to two different info areas, for instance. Now, in the course, every student has been assigned to one info area. Okay, or maybe a better way to say this is that an info area has been created for each student. Okay, so you have your own info area, which allows you to store your info object catalogs and info objects and so on. Okay, so make sure you, when you create info objects and info object catalogs and so on, make sure you do create those objects under your own info area. So this way you can easily identify and access those objects later on if necessary. Okay, so it's just a way to organize things in BW. All right, when you're ready to create info objects, which is described in detail in the book, which you will also follow as part of your assignment, first you will create info area. Okay, but as I just mentioned that an info area has been created for each student, so you can skip that step in your assignment. But in practice, notice that we'll have to do that as a first step. Okay, But again, you can skip that in the assignment. And then after that, you create InfoObject catalog under your own info area. Okay, and then after that, you can then create an InfoObject following the example in the book. Okay, but when you create an InfoObject, first you need to give it a name, and there are some rules that we need to follow. The naming convention in the book on page 77. There are only a few rules. Please make sure you read about them. For instance, one, you can only use English letters and a few special characters. Okay, so normally we stay with English letters. You cannot begin a name with a number also. Okay, and in fact, by convention, any object that begins their name with 0 is one supplied by SAP. Okay, so 0 something is an SAP object. So you never want to use 0 or other numbers to begin as the name for your object. Okay, and also you can only have from 3 to 9 characters. So I guess the restrictions, there are more restrictions to the legal names in BW than in other systems such as Windows. Okay, I guess Windows is a personal computer product, so it is more liberal in this regard. Okay. So after you give the object a name, you then are ready to configure the info object. Okay, basically to set up the different options for the info object that you just created, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides. Okay, after you enter the name and description of the characteristics, you are then ready to configure it to further define its attributes. Okay. One, on the general tab, you can define the type and size. Okay, the data type and the size or the length of the data. For instance, this is further described on page 80. The data type may be character data or numeric data or dates or times. Okay, so you can choose either one, and then after that you can define the size. Okay, how long the field or how wide the field is. Okay, for instance, 10 characters, 20 characters, and so on. On the Business Explorer tab, you will then define how data will be displayed in the back's tools. And thirdly, on the master data / text tab, you can then specify optional attributes and text. Okay, I mentioned earlier that for each piece of master data, we can define additionally tags and hierarchies. Okay, so and attributes. So if we have additional attributes we want to define, that's where we define it. And on the hierarchy tab, you will then define the hierarchy if there is any. We can manually enter the hierarchy there, or we can load the hierarchies from external systems such as SAP ECC. Then on the attributes tab, if you have additional attributes, additional optional attributes you want to define, this is where you define them. And also notice that the attributes may be display attributes or navigational attributes, which we'll explain in more detail on the next slide. And finally, there is a compounding tab which can be used to define composite keys. So, for instance, if you have characteristic such as name. Name by itself is not unique. You can then add another characteristic such as city. Okay, so Joe Smith probably is not a unique name in your system. Okay, but if we include the city when the person is residing, Joe Smith in Atlanta, for instance, then that's probably unique. Or if that is still not unique, you can then further define another characteristic to make it a unique characteristic. Okay, let's take a look at some screenshots to better understand the various tabs associated with the configuration of characteristics. On the General tab, as you can see here, there are various data fields such as data type and length in the middle of the screen there. In fact, those are the only two fields that are required. Okay, all the other fields are optional. And then below data type and length, you see there is a conversion routine, which we'll talk more about on the next few slides. Okay, conversion routine is needed when we are entering data in a certain format that is different from the format that is used by SAP for the data to be stored in the database. For instance, in the SAP database, the internal format for a date is shown there, YYYY, MM, and DD. Okay, so it is a 8-digit number beginning with 4 digits for year and 2 digits for months and 2 digits for date. Okay, but when a user is entering a date, depending on where they are located, if they are located in a European country, for instance, the date format normally is DD dot MM dot YYYY. Okay, so date followed by month followed by year, and separated by periods. Whereas in the US, the format, at least one common format, is month/day/year. All right. So similarly, numbers they are also formatted differently in Europe versus in the US. All right. So either way, a transformation is needed to convert the format from user input to internal storage in SAP. And vice versa. Okay, when the SAP data is displayed to a user, some kind of conversion may also be needed. So that's where conversion routine is needed, and we'll talk about two common routines on the next two slides. But there are several more that you can learn about if you're interested from other sources. All right, the first conversion routine we'll talk about is the alpha conversion routine, which is a very common routine for data type defined as CHAR or char in SAP. So when we create an info object and we define that as character data, no, I should say char type, then it can be used to store both character as well as numeric values. Okay, and for a chop data type, the default conversion routine or default conversion exit is alpha. Okay, so alpha is used by SAP automatically unless you specifically say no. Okay, if you don't want to use alpha routine, you have to delete that from the conversion field. Okay. Now, what's the purpose of the alpha conversion routine? As shown in the example there, let's say we are defining a characteristic for material number, okay, and we define that as char 8. Okay, so it's a char data type with 8 bytes. Okay, so 8 spaces that we can use to enter a material number. So if our material number is something like example there 100-110, okay. Now, if we enter something like that, it will be considered a character value. Okay, it is not a number, in other words. So if it's a character value, then the conversion routine doesn't do anything. Okay, so it will just take whatever is entered and store it as is. And if you notice that there is actually one space at the end after the 0 there, so it is stored just like that in the database as well. Okay, so in other words, 100-110 and then followed by a space. However, if we enter a number, okay, such as 1, 2, 3, 4 as the material number, then SAP will store that as 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, in other words, it will add 4 leading zeros to the number that we enter as the material number. So for all numbers, a leading zero may be added if the number doesn't take up the entire space that is allocated. Now, this is very similar to something you have seen before in SAP ECC. Okay, if you remember that whenever you create something in SAP, like a sales order or purchase order, delivery note, and so on. Okay, after you create it and then you save it, SAP will give you a message at the bottom of the screen that says, for instance, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 175 has been saved. Okay, so it will give you a document number with a bunch of zeros followed by maybe 3 digits telling you that a particular document has been saved. Okay. Now, I know that some professors require their students to write down the document numbers whenever they finish a transaction successfully. Okay, so students will write down a bunch of 0 followed by the actual number like 175. But really, those numbers are redundant. We don't really need to keep track of all the zeros, okay, because they are added automatically by SAP. Because in reality, like 10 spaces have been allocated for the number, whereas only 3 are used. Okay, so the conversion routine actually works both ways. You will do the conversion from user input to internal format used in the database, and vice versa. Okay, so when SAP displays a document number or a custom number, whatever, it will not display all the leading zeros in front of it. Okay, you just display, for instance, in our example, material number 1, 2, 3, 4 in a text box if it is required. Okay. So alpha routine is very useful if we are dealing with numbers. The next conversion routine is Matney. This routine is used specifically for material numbers. Okay, they require special treatment in SAP. So SAP has developed this routine to handle material numbers. And again, as you can see here, the data type is defined as char, and this routine can do a couple of things. One of them is that it allows an edit format to be defined so that user can easily input a material number by following a familiar format that they have been using in the real world. Okay, for instance, in the real world, in this particular company, they may define material number with 2 characters followed by a dash and followed by 4 numbers. Okay, such as RB dash 0010. Okay, so to make it easy for users, the input field would then have 2 spaces for the characters, followed by a dash there automatically, and then followed by 4 spaces for the numbers. So the user can easily enter the information material number that is very familiar to them. But internally, the material number is stored without the dash. Okay, so internally, number is stored as RB 0010, and of course, that is considered a character data value as opposed to a number. All right, the next tab I want to talk about is the master data / text tab. Okay, on this tab we can actually define 2 things. One is text that you see on the right hand side. We can specify actually 3 types of text in terms of size or length. Okay, we can specify short text, medium text, or long text. It's up to the user requirement. We can also specify whether it's language dependent. If yes, then we can specify multiple descriptions for a material, for instance. Okay, and also we can specify whether the text will be time dependent. So on the right part, we can specify anything related to the text associated with this info object. Then on the left side, toward the top, there is a checkbox for us to check if there is master data exists for this particular info object. Okay. Now here, the master data actually means attributes. Okay, remember that an info object or characteristic info object can have optional master data, including attributes, tags, and hierarchies. Okay, and I just talked about tags, and hierarchy is on a separate tab, and then attributes are also on a separate tab. But you need to check the checkbox here with the master data checkbox in order to activate the attribute tab. Okay, otherwise you won't be able to define the attributes for this particular info object. So after we check the checkbox for master data, then the attribute tab will become available. Then we can enter any attributes that are associated with this particular info object. Okay, in this example there, here, the info object that we are trying to configure is sales organization, right? If you look at the top, the short description is sales organization. And in order to describe additional information about sales organization, we can add additional attributes at the bottom there. Okay, attributes like company code, country key, currency key, and so on. All right, and notice that those attributes are actually info objects themselves that have already been defined in the system, so that we can include them here as the attributes for the new info object sales organization we are trying to create at this point. And then also for each attribute, we can define that as either navigational or display attribute, which we'll talk more about next. All right, talked about earlier that for attributes, we have to, we can specify they are display or navigational attributes. Okay. But first of all, remember all the attributes themselves are info objects that we have already defined. Okay, so we have defined some info objects in the system, and then we can use those info objects as attributes of other info objects. Okay, so some info objects such as house number, email address are shown here, which of course may be of interest when we are displaying information about our customers or suppliers and so on. Okay. On the other hand, we probably won't drill down a report based on that kind of data or information. Okay. So we don't really need to navigate based on those info objects. So we simply define those as display attributes, so they can be displayed in the report, but we don't need to use them as navigational attributes. Okay, so this way it's easy for BW to handle those attributes. It will have less system overhead if we define display attributes versus navigational attributes. Okay, so unless it is really necessary, we will not define an attribute as a navigational attribute. This screenshot shows where we can identify an attribute as navigational. By default, they are all display attributes. So if we want to change it to a navigational, we can then change on the attribute tab. Okay. Similarly, after we create a key figure, after we enter a name and description for that, we then need to configure the key figure. On the type/unit tab, basically we need to define what kind of key figures are we talking about. And there are 6 different types we talked about earlier. So if it's an amount, we need to specify a currency, and also we can specify a fixed currency or variable currency. Okay, so a fixed maybe US dollars or Canadian dollars, Japanese yen, and so on. Or if we are dealing with many different countries, then it'd be probably easier if we define a unit info object for different currencies. Okay, and similarly, if we defining creating a quantity key figure, we then need to have a unit specified, and the unit can be fixed, pounds or kilograms, miles, and so on, or similarly a variable unit of measure. Okay, depending on our situation. Okay, a screenshot of the type/unit tab with some examples. For instance, for the key figure, we can define one of the 6 different types, such as an amount, But also notice that for each type, there are different data types that we can define. Right now it is showing CURR as the currency field for the amount. Another choice is to define that as a floating point number. Okay, now the book actually has detailed description about the different data types if you are interested in learning more about the detail. Then on the aggregation tab, we can specify how the key figures are to be aggregated. Okay. Now there are actually two sections on this tab. They are kind of related. Okay. The first section is aggregation section, in which we define how the key figure will be aggregated. Basically, how the key figure will be processed when we are doing a roll up in OLED operations. If you recall, in roll up, we'll hide the detail in the report, right? So, for instance, if we had sales figures for monthly, 12 months, we can then hide the detail and just present a yearly sales figure. So the 12 numbers, 12 sales numbers will be converted into one yearly sales number. And in this case, the aggregation will probably be the sum function, right? Normally, we will sum up the numbers when we roll up. For instance, we will add up 12 months sales to create a one yearly sale. And similarly, when you roll up sales for individual products or materials to material group, you will also use the sum function. Okay, so in most cases, the sum function is the standard aggregation for a key figure. However, some key figures require exception handling. We have exception aggregation. For instance, if we are dealing with the head count, okay, let's say the company is interested in keeping track of the number of employees that they have, because that represents some kind of cost they want to keep a handle on, right? So the number of employees at any point in time that is recorded, let's say every month or every quarter or every year, then when we move on to next year or next quarter, and when we roll up, we probably do not want to add up the quarterly numbers, for instance. Okay. Instead, we want to look at the latest number or the number from the latest quarter when we report the number of employees that we have in our company right now. Okay, so in that particular example, the aggregation is probably better defined as the last value as opposed to the regular sum. Okay, so standard aggregation, we can have sum, maximum, minimum, and so on. Okay, we have different choices, but in most cases, sum is probably the one that we will use. And similarly, with exception, we can choose last value, average, or counter, and so on. But the example that I just gave you will use last value. In the next section of the aggregation tab, we'll define the key figure as either cumulative or non-cumulative. Okay, most key figures are cumulative. Okay, that means we want to accumulate the values over time. For instance, example, sales or cost of goods sold. Things like that. Okay, we want to add them up over time to keep track of our sales. in the last 3 months, our sales in the last 5 years, things like that. Okay, so we want to accumulate those key figures over time. However, some key figures should be defined as non-cumulative. Okay, example there, market share, or even the headcount example I gave you earlier. Okay, market share is another example that we probably want to use the non-cumulative. Okay, because market share is an important key figure. For instance, if you look at the sales of smartphone right now, the two big competitors, Apple's iOS versus Android smartphones. Okay, so the market share of these two operating systems is closely watched key figure. So we will have a number for the market share. Let's say every month or every quarter recorded in our system. But when you do reporting, you probably do not want to add up the market shares from one quarter to another to show your current market share. Okay, instead you want to show the current number of market share based on the most current data. All right, so cumulative versus non-cumulative, there is also a difference between certain key figures. Now at this time you may be wondering, well, is that kind of similar to aggregation we talked about earlier? Sum versus last value. Okay, some key figures we will use sum, others we use last value. Well, the answer is yes and no. Okay, yes, the nature is kind of similar, but the big difference is that for aggregation, the operation happens at the report level. Okay, that is when we run a report based on certain key figures. Okay, in BACS analyzer, for instance, we display the sales, or we display the head count, we display the market share, whatever, and when we roll up, SAP needs to know whether we want to sum up the numbers, or do we want to use a different aggregation method. Okay, so aggregation happens when a report is being run in a BI tool. Okay, whereas the cumulative versus non-cumulative designation is defined at the storage level. So that would define how the key figure will be stored actually inside BW database. And we'll see more example later on the cumulative versus non-cumulative. Yeah, actually on this slide, you see that for the aggregation tab, under the aggregation section, again, standard aggregation, you have sum, maximum, minimum, and so on. And then for exception aggregation, you can have sum, last value, maximum, average, and so on. And then the aggregation reference characteristic basically is the one that we will use to aggregate the key figure. Okay, in this example, the reference characteristic is quarter. So when we want to display the number of employees per quarter, then we will use the last value. Okay. All right. Now this screen shows examples, additional examples of cumulative versus non-cumulative key figures. Okay, and here is an example of a non-cumulative key figure, such as inventory level. Okay, inventory level. Again, is probably something that is important that we want to track over time. So, as you can see, toward the top of the screen, maybe every 2 weeks we want to report the inventory level, right? So, you see the reference point 1 has an inventory level of 20 units, and then reference point 2 has a level of 35. Okay. So I guess it's probably tracked every month. Okay. But anyway, so we want to track the inventory level every month, and this should be defined as a non-cumulative key figure, right? Because you don't want to add up the inventory levels from different months to show your inventory situation. Okay, instead you want to report the current inventory level, and you also want to keep track of the changes over time in the data warehouse. Okay, so for instance, in reference point 1, you had 20 units, all right? And in reference point number 2, you had 35. Okay, but the question is, how do we know that reference point 2 has 35 units? All right. Now there are actually 2 ways to get that information into the warehouse. They are shown toward the bottom of the screen. The first way is to use a non-cumulative value change text box. Okay, so in that text box, if we choose that method, then SAP BW will expect a number that represents the net change of inventory value from the first month to the second month. Okay, so the net change may be a positive number or it may be a negative number. It doesn't matter. It will then be used to calculate the current inventory level. All right. So, for instance, in reference point 1, we had 20 units. Therefore, the net value change based on the graphic there would be plus 15, right? So 20 plus 15, you get 35 at the end. Okay, so that's how SAP BW can display 35 at reference point number 2. Now the second method is toward the very bottom. We will then have 2 key figures associated with this inventory level. Okay, one is called inflow, the other is called outflow. Okay, inflow basically means the addition to the inventory level, whereas outflow means the reduction in inventory level. Okay, so over this 1 month period, if we have any additional inventory, we'll have a number represented in the inflow key figure, and if we have any deduction, that will be represented in the outflow key figure. Okay. Now in this particular example, since we only have positive numbers occur, plus 10 and plus 5, so inflow will be 15. Okay, and there's no outflow. So again, we use 20 and then we add 15 to it. So now in reference point number 2, BW will get 35 as the inventory level. All right, so the book also has a similar example that you can follow if you want to read more about it. Okay, but basically, as you can, as I hope you will understand, that for non-cumulative key figures, it takes additional system overhead processing to get the answer to our question in terms of the inventory level, okay, because BW needs to keep track of the inventory level at each time period, okay, at each reference point, plus it has to calculate when the report is run to derive the actual inventory level. So it will take longer to display a report if the key figure is non-cumulative versus the regular cumulative key figure. All right, so I guess the rule of thumb is that we want to use cumulative whenever possible to make it more efficient. Okay. On the other hand, certain situations such as the inventory level or head count, those kind of key figures will have to be defined as non-cumulative. All right. Finally, on the additional properties tab, we can configure additional information if we want, like decimal places, display, and so on. Okay. All right. Final review question about characteristics.